Hello YouTube, good evening from the Czech Republic. So I'm here with the first video ever, and well, I was wondering for quite some time what my first video will be about. I thought it might be some, let's say, happier topic, but it is not. So let me get straight to it. My topic for today is actually uh, a process of tightening up of the firearms legislation in the Europe. This is actually quite a big deal, at least here in the Czech Republic. Last couple of months or maybe a year. Well, what's happening is that the European Union representatives have decided to strengthen the European Union legislation for the firearms ownership. And as long as I realize that in many countries across the European Union, owning a firearm is actually something that is not quite common, and in some cases even impossible. I, as a sport shooter and let's say an enthusiast collector, along with 300,000 of my colleagues in the Czech Republic, we are outraged and very disturbed about what's going on. Uh, just for those who don't know what this legislation is about, its main point, as they say, is to prevent further terrorist attacks like the one in Paris or Brussels, Nice, and Berlin, and many others across the globe. They were actually committed using illegal guns. Well, that sounds quite rational. However, the way they decided to actually ensure the higher level of security is just unacceptable. So they've decided that the private ownership of firearms should be limited to an extreme extent, and I cannot accept that. Therefore, I've decided to write an open letter to all the European Union representatives, so members of European Parliament, members of European Commission, members of the European Council, all these people that are in favor of tightening up the rules. I would like to send them these people a message, and it's actually in the audio form because I know that there's been a huge activity, huge let's say wave of letters from many countries in the Europe and especially from the Czech Republic because sport shooting has a huge tradition up here. So I've decided to let's say go this way via an audio form because I guess it has more chances to reach those that are really responsible for the new legislation. So please consider this to be the open letter to the European Union representatives, explaining why we are so outraged and why we feel betrayed by the European Union. So, dear European Union representatives, I have decided to share with you my view on the Firearms Directive as proposed by European Commission and which is now being prepared for a final vote in the European Union Parliament. I find this problematic very crucial and the current form of the directive extremely disturbing, and therefore I have decided to write this open letter. I am a sport shooter, military enthusiast, and collector, and I own two firearms on which your proposal would apply. One of them would be illegal due to magazine capacity, the other one has collapsible stock and is based on Army assault rifle known as VZ-58 here in the Czech Republic. I find this whole situation unfair, disturbing, and unacceptable intrusion to my human rights. Let me therefore share with you a few points of view related to these problematics. So, point number one, the new legislation criminalizes a part of the society. At the time when the whole Union presents itself as a society open to new cultures, society refusing to oppress anyone based on his or her sex, belief, sexual orientation, opinions, etc., you are doing completely the opposite towards the gun owners. I personally have never had even the tiniest problem with the law in my country, the Czech Republic. Not even a parking or speeding ticket, and therefore I feel betrayed by your attempts to force my country to restrict firearms legislation here. What you are actually doing here is that you are pointing fingers at us, shooters, hunters, and collectors, saying this is a potential terrorist or criminal or whatever, because he has a gun at home. But am I? Do you really want us to feel like a suspected terrorist? I don't think that owning a firearm means that someone is dangerous or that someone poses some security risk. So please think about this point. Number two, you bend facts and lie to those unaware of the problematics. Oh yes, I did say that. We are constantly presenting you the facts which you either refuse to accept, ignore, or bend against us. The terrorists who committed the despicable crimes in Paris, Brussels, Nice, or Berlin were using illegally obtained firearms and relied on defenselessness of their victims. Do you see the point here finally? If you ban legal guns, you cannot prevent terrorist attacks from happening if the perpetrators use illegally smuggled firearms. But it is, of course, a complicated process to eliminate black gun market, and so you picked up the easiest target instead. People whom you expect will follow the legislation because they have ever been doing so. It is quite sad that you punish a part of the European Union society for your incompetence in fighting black market. In addition to that, you refuse to accept the argument that the amount of legally owned firearms has zero impact on country security. We have almost 300,000 firearms license holders in the country, owning close to 800,000 guns, including the large number of former military guns, semi-automatics, that would be now categorized as prohibited. And against all prejudices, we are one of the safest countries in Europe. To be more specific, according to United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime statistics from 2014, the crime rate in the Czech Republic was 0.7 with only 68 homicides. Compared to Germany, with 0.9 and 716 victims, France with 1.2 including 792 victims, and Belgium reaching more than double compared to the Czech Republic, 1.8 with a casualty of 202. Let me quickly remind you that concealed carry of a gun is allowed in the Czech Republic and practiced quite often, I have to say. That clearly presents the bitter fact that some European Union officials refuse to accept neither the amount nor the type structure of firearms has a negative effect on the country's security. Number 3. In the name of fight for more security, you make us more vulnerable. Do you know the technical term the security experts use for unarmed victim of terrorist attack? It is so-called soft target. I'm quite unsure how it sounds to you, but it definitely sounds quite bad to me, and I'm sure I don't want to become one. Instead of thinking, if you were to victim a terrorist attack knowing the police cannot arrive at the scene immediately, because contrary to the popular belief among some of you, they cannot be everywhere, would you prefer yourself being armed and trained to use the gun for the protection of yourself, your family, and any other citizens around, or would you like to be an unarmed soft target? I believe it is not such a difficult question to answer. Am I right? It is the same as if you were to get lost in the forest during the night. Would you prefer to do so with a box of matches in your pocket or without them? I assume a way to light a fire might be a useful thing to do, even though some bad guys can also use the same matches to burn the forest down. So it doesn't depend on whether or not the matches are possessed by someone, but by whom. It is therefore incorrect for the state to prohibit the right for responsible individual to own matches. It is the state's obligation to make sure as little bad guys as possible will have access to them. Number 4. European Union promises to limit the impact on sport shooters as much as possible. Well, perhaps this is a misunderstanding, but can you please explain to me why my rights should be limited at all? I have done nothing wrong. I pose zero risk to my environment. Therefore, I do not understand why should my rights be impacted to whatever extent. That is completely unacceptable approach, is it not? Number 5, social political aspect. Well, the modern state has several ways how to show its trust in the individual. One of them, probably the most sincere way to do so, is the ability to get firearms for sport, hunting, or self-defense. By that, the state shows the individual the faith in him and also presents its persuasion of individual's ability to act with utmost responsibility with which he or she will be treating the gun. On the other hand, the state which simply denies this right shows little respect towards democracy, low faith in the citizens' ability to handle such responsibility, and exerts way too much control over its population. Now it's a question how you want to be perceived by the citizens of the European Union. Number 6. Abuse of legally owned firearms. In your eyes, each and every gun owner is a potential risk. Contrary to the popular belief of yours, guns are not legally obtained by mentally disturbed individuals, drug users, alcoholics, terrorists, and criminals. And it is not only about acquiring the firearms license, but about keeping it also. It means that we, firearms license holders, are much more careful about even the simple traffic violations, alcohol, and any other activity that might potentially be evaluated as an offense or criminal act, because then we would lose the firearms license. It is also highly improbable that someone else would abuse our guns for committing terrorist attack. The Czech law outlines very, very thoroughly how should the guns be secured at home and how the vault for storing guns should look like. And let me be honest, none of the typical terrorist, frustrated or radicalized young individuals would be able to open the vault when it is easier to simply buy the gun within the black market. In other words, you should focus on black market, not the legal gun owners. Number 7. Is repression a solution? Let's say your amendment passes the whole process and is implemented. I'm wondering, how are you going to make sure the guns confiscated by the authorities will not reach the black market? There is no way to do that actually. There is no chance to guarantee that these guns will not get into the hands of the real threat, criminals and terrorists. And what about us, gun owners? I personally have invested thousands of euros to my guns, my colleagues even more. Are you going to buy these guns from us for the market price? Because if not, that does once again sounds like totalitarianism and its process of expropriation, which under no circumstances belongs to the modern democracy of the 21st century. And if yes, who is going to pay for this? The people? From their taxes? Are the citizens going to be forced to pay for a worsening of their security? Okay, so to sum up what was said in the letter, there are a few questions that each and every European Union representative should ask him or herself before raising hand for this new legislation as proposed by the European Commission. These questions are: do you want to criminalize the society, the abiding citizens, sport shooters, hunters, collectors, and enthusiasts? Do you really want to label them terrorists and criminals just because they own a firearm? Do you really want to introduce measurements that we already know will have zero impact on terrorism and criminality and will only limit the rights of law-abiding citizens? Do you really want to show the people that you really do not respect their rights, that you do not believe in their ability to handle the responsibility that is in firearm ownership? Do you really want another European Union member state to think about leaving the Union? Because, as I said, there are 300,000 sport shooters, hunters, and gun owners in the Czech Republic, and all of them are very disappointed by our attempts to limit their rights, and they are actually beginning to support the process of the Czech Republic leaving the European Union.